joining. My name is Josh Singer. I'm the DC Parks and Rec Community Garden Specialist. So I work on building urban ag projects around the city, urban farms and gardens and stuff. And then also we work on doing a lot of support systems for urban ag, like compost cooperatives, tool shares, greenhouse cooperatives, and then we do a lot of education courses. So and this course tonight is actually part of our summer series, which only has about one more week left before it wraps up. But since COVID hit, we kind of turned all of our classes really quickly into webinars and had a crash course on webinars. But we've done like 40 or so webinars. All of them are posted on the Doug Network website. If you haven't checked them out, there's some really great webinars, really cool stuff throughout the series. And then this Thursday, I think it's City Blossoms and U.S. Botanic Gardens are doing a really cool one on working with kids and gardens. So if you have any children, it's a really cool one. And a lot of times, I think people got on. They're like, a lot of people are just watching this a lot of people registered, but they're just watching the recording. So if you want to join, we're just inviting anyone that wants to come, or if you know people as well. So feel free. If there's a waiting list, don't worry. We're letting everybody on but I think there's only like 3 or 4 classes left. Or maybe just 2, and then the week after that, we have this awesome EPA scientist who's going to do a soil biology class. She was supposed to do it earlier, but had to postpone. So if you want to learn some cool soil biology pertaining to gardens, definitely check it out. But yeah, tonight's class, it's a Roots of a Food Apartheid. So I created this class a couple years ago. Just trying to bring some more intentionality to a lot of our projects, a lot of our farms and gardens and food access projects. Because it's easy, it's easy to kind of look at a community and say, hey, look at this community, they're food insecure. Let's just get some food to them, problem solve, pat ourselves on the back, and great. Which don't get me wrong. I mean, they call that like Band-Aids, it's putting on Band-Aids to the problem. So we'll never really get into the roots of what's actually causing that food insecurity, which don't get me wrong. I mean, like Band-Aids are important. A lot of people are alive, from Band-Aids, and there's a lot of evil people trying to take away Band-Aids. So those, they're important. Like, let's continue doing that, but at the same time, while we're helping, meet a need, let's also, start understanding what's creating that need in the first place. Let's get to some of the roots of what's causing food insecurities. So we're going to kind of dive into that a little bit. And we're going to kind of look at, some of the systems of oppression. When I say systems, I mean like patriarchy, neoliberal capitalism, and white supremacy. When I say white supremacy, I'm not really talking about white supremacists. That's one outcome of white supremacy, but I'm talking about more of, so is racial wealth gaps and housing discrimination, police brutality. There's a lot of outcomes of white supremacy. What I'm referring to more is these automatic systems that benefit white people, politically, socially, economically, culturally, and have for many centuries, and continue to benefit white people automatically at the expense of Black, Indigenous people of color, oftentimes the exploitation of them. So these systems happen regardless, of whether we're aware of them or whether we want them to happen, whether we agree with them. We're all born into this world, and this is the systems that operate in this world. For example, you can Google, if you pull out your phone and Google, Google image search, like beautiful women, you'll see tons of pictures of white people. And if you Google criminal, you'll see tons of pictures of Black people. That's going to happen regardless, if you want it to happen, if you agree with it, if you think you're part of it, if you're even aware of it's happening. It's going to happen. We talk about in a lot of other classes, like there's been a lot of studies about studies where they took 2 resumes, one with a white sounding name and one with a Black sounding name, sent them off to the same employees, and what they found is like at the conservative end, the white sounding names would get 2 to 3 times the amount of callbacks. And then, some of the studies, it was like 10 to 15 to 20 times. And that's not because, there's a bunch of, evil white supremacists in the HR departments. That's because the HR departments are full of white people, just like the rest of us, who were born into this white supremacy society. And we were taught, we absorb unconsciously, consciously and unconsciously, all the things from our family, friends, our very whitewashed Eurocentric education to our just our culture and all the histories and to the point where we just look at their resume and without even thinking, we just feel like that white sounding name is a little bit better, or maybe a little qualified or more reliable, or something like that. So that bias is something that we absorb through our systems that we grew up in, and it comes out in everything from police to our school systems to work environments, our families. It comes out everywhere. And the big thing is, it's not really about it's not something to feel shame of. We were all born into it. It's more about just understanding what we're like, none of us chose this, but we were all born into this as reality, and we need to understand this reality and the systems we were born into, so we can all do our part to kind of dismantle some of these systems and create a better world. So that's what this course is going to be about. We're going to kind of explore some of these systems, past and present, that have created these food insecurities in a lot of our communities, especially around in DC. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop my video. Hopefully no one sees anything on their screens. Let me know if you do. So how I typically do with if you have a question in the middle of the present, slide, just type it into the Zoom chat, and then after each slide, I'll talk about I'll look at the chat box and address any questions. But and then from there, if we want to have some discussions, if you want to unmute yourself and talk a little bit more, add or have some discussions, we can as well. I know not everyone's a fast typer, so don't worry. But let's try to have those in between the slides, unless you feel like there's something urgent that needs to be said, and then feel free. I mean, we have a small enough group that we can be kind of informal. So starting out, I want to start out this slide with a native land acknowledgement. So this is something that a lot of people have been pushing for right now, especially particularly the U.S. Department of Arts and Agriculture actually created this honor native land guide to call to acknowledgement. They're really trying to push this because we talk about, we're going to be talking about a lot of, the roots of a lot of our problems, which are going to be like white supremacy and patriarchy and things like that. But ultimately, the roots to those problems are ultimately colonialism, and that really goes back to 14, 1500s into these systems, of capitalism and colonialism and patriarchy and all these systems that were, they weren't the first people to create these systems, but they were definitely the first to export it in every to every corner of the world. So when we talk about decolonizing, a lot of times we're talking about identifying these colonial systems, even though a lot of these countries have have gained independence from their colonial governments. They've never really addressed a lot of the colonial systems that they're left over, U.S. including. So when we talk about decolonizing, we're particularly talking about breaking down and dismantling a lot of these systems. And a big system of colonialism was just the erasure of history of native land. This idea that no one was really our history doesn't really start until our colonial times. So that's one thing that we're trying to do with all workshops and public events and stuff. People are really pushing to do this native land acknowledgement. I'll just read this middle of this long quote. Acknowledgement is a simple and powerful way of showing respect and a step towards correcting the stories and practices that erase indigenous people's histories and cultures toward inviting and honoring the truth. And so I'll be honest, I've lived in DC, almost 20 years, and I had to actually, when I was creating a slide, I had to actually research, I went to this really great website, Research Native Land, to really find out, our history before, pre-colonial times. So so the standard acknowledgement of, so basically the tribes, what I learned is there was a lot of tribes in this area. The main one was Anacostan people, and they were part of the Piscataway tribe. So the actual, they have a land acknowledgement, standard where they say, we acknowledge that this meeting is taking place on the traditional land of Anacostan people of the Piscataway tribe. And they had lots of different tribes, but eventually they were forcibly removed. A lot of them died from diseases, warfare, and the tribe kind of dissolved into the other Piscataway tribe. So I just want to read this last quote from Londana Redmond. We must understand that the land that we stand on it because of someone else's blood is on it. And then if you want to learn more, they have a really great guide and they have really great video and stuff. And it's a pretty awesome, the U.S. Department of Art and Culture. The next thing I want to kind of just talk about, I want to spend a second kind of setting some intentions and settings of what's happening in this world and how this kind of relates to what we're going to be talking about today. So I actually have these two different quotes kind of speaking with what's happening. It really, in a sense, we're seeing international uprisings against police brutality and white supremacy right now. We're seeing that, all over our country, but we're seeing it all over the world. And I was just reading about in Australia, the Aborigine tribes or Aborigine people they're launching. They have this huge, Black Lives Matter movements in Australia right now, and I'm sure they care about George Floyd, but that really wasn't the cause. I mean, the main cause was Aborigine people, or although they're a small percentage of the population, they make up the majority of people that are arrested and experience police brutality. So this is really like what we're seeing. Like we need to be focused on campaigns like defunding police and things like that. But at the same time, we need to understand that this is just one kind of root of a bigger problem of white supremacy that was exported to every corner of this country. And so I'm just going to read these two quotes really quickly. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes this first one. The truth is that the police reflect America and all of its will and fear, and whatever we might make of this country's criminal justice policy, it cannot be said that it was imposed by a repressive minority. The abuses that have followed from these policies, the sprawling carceral straight state, the random detention of Black people, the torture of suspects, are a product of the democratic will. And so to challenge the police is to challenge the American people who send them into the ghettos armed with the same self-generated fears that compelled the people who think they are white to flee the cities. And we're actually going to talk a lot about white flight today as well, and what really compelled them. And then the second quote I just wanted to read real quickly. John Stewart is a recent quote. So Ta-Nehisi Coates, that was from Between the World and Me, a really great book. I definitely recommend checking out. But John Stewart just wrote this recent one from, I think, a Rolling Stone interview. He says, the police are a reflection of society. They're not a rogue alien organization that came down to torment the Black community. They're enforcing segregation. Segregation is legally over, but it never ended. The police are, in some respects, a border patrol, and they patrol the border between the two Americas. And that's another really big concept that we're going to be talking about today is segregation, and how, even though we have outlawed it, it's still being enforced in many different ways. And it's one of the many roots of what's causing food insecurity in a lot of our communities. And also, so we're going to kind of talk about, briefly about a lot of different histories today, particularly in the last century. But there's just so much, history that I'm actually part of this a course called the Intro to Racism and White Privilege webinar series. So we, if you're looking to get, learn a little bit more, kind of dive a little bit deeper into different histories, we just started in July. It's 3 classes a month. We talk about all different topics from around racism and white privilege and white supremacies, particularly in a lot of history in our country. I used to be a high school history teacher, and I could tell you the history that we teach, it's really impossible to understand what's happening in this world. With that history, that Eurocentric history, whitewash history that we teach. So definitely, if you're interested in checking out, we're actually recording all of our classes. You can sign up to receive the recordings for free. Yeah, definitely check it out. And there's a lot of media, a lot of videos and resources and stuff that you can pull away and use for. Cool. So that course is also part of this another initiative that we launched a little while ago called the People's School of DC. This initiative is a resource website like a social justice resource website for DC, where if people are looking to like try to figure out, different groups and organizations in the area that they want to get more involved with, we outline all different kinds of organizations. We have, on our Facebook, we have tons of different, social justice actions and events and webinars and lectures and things like that. So if you're looking to get more involved or to try to figure out how to tap into, all the amazing things, around social justice happening in DC, definitely check out that website. And follow us on Facebook. You'll hear, every day there's just tons of amazing, events happening in DC. All right, so thank you for that long intro. I just kind of wanted to cover a couple things, but now we are ready to kind of dive into the presentation. Oh, cool, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Megan. Cool, so just a second, I'm gonna turn a fan on real quick. It's pretty hot in the basement. All right, thank you. Sorry about that. It's super hot in my basement right now. So cool. Well, thank you for surviving the long intro. Now we're going to kind of dive into the course. So this is the Roots of Food Apartheid's course. The first section, we're going to talk about two different approaches when approaching food insecurities, from food deserts to food apartheids. The second, we're going to talk about more about food apartheids and kind of talk about what that really means and kind of dive into the histories and the realities behind that. And then the third section, we're going to kind of talk about possible solutions and different ways that we can get involved directly, specifically with in the DC area. All right, so the first part, food deserts versus food apartheid. So this is a map of, it's a little bit of an old map, but it shows all the different grocery stores in the DC area. And you can see how majority of them are up in the, what we call east of or west of the river, Anacostia River, and very few are down here, or even less, I think today. So what we're going to talk about is different approaches to when we see these neighborhoods that don't have a lot of food, don't have access to grocery stores or access to any kind of affordable food. We're going to talk about two different approaches on how to kind of analyze that and what's going on in those communities. And the first approach is a food desert approach. So this was so they created this. The food desert has been, the idea has been around for a long time, since like the 1970s, I believe. But really in the last decade, this definition has really taken off. That's particularly with USDA. They've started to, they did a massive campaign of like analyzing different food insecure areas with this idea of trying to identify what they defined as food deserts. And how they defined that was that they were looking for places and communities that had I think it was you had to walk at least a half mile to a grocery store. There's less than 40% of the households had no vehicle availability, and the majority of the people in that community lived below the poverty line. So that means even if there was a grocery store close, that was within a half, mile or 2 mile, it was still, it's a long way to walk to carry grocery stores. And if you don't have access to vehicles or things like that, then that, that's really going to restrict your ability to get, access to healthy food. So they spent a while analyzing this. They found food deserts all over the country, urban, rural areas, like everywhere. But after they started analyzing it for a while, they started realizing that there was a racial, disparity happening. What they noticed that a lot of these food deserts, fell in more communities of color, particularly like Black communities that were more likely to experience this food insecurity. There's food deserts in white communities. There's food deserts in rural communities, but majority of the food deserts were more likely into like urban Black communities. And from that, they found, the families of color had, significantly less, access to good quality food and healthy and affordable food. And at the same time, they saw significant, health effects. A lot higher rates of diet-related illnesses in Black communities, particularly like Black Indigenous and people of color communities, but particularly Black and Indigenous communities as well. So they started realizing that there was a racial component to these food deserts. That it wasn't just those three components, those three standards from the food desert standards. So then if we take that, we start looking at, what's happening in DC, we start noticing that, there are, 49 full service grocery stores in DC. We have a lot of grocery stores. We have a lot of access to grocery stores in DC. But if we look east of the river, which is particularly Ward 7 and Ward 8, and those are majority Black, districts, or wards, we noticed that there's actually only 3 grocery stores. I think there's 4 dots here, but one of them closed down. There's only 3 grocery stores serving the entire, over 150,000 residents. And then the places that have lots of grocery stores you're going to find a lot more, white residents there. And then we see, east of the river that in transportation rise, it's a lot harder, close to 50% of residents have no access to personal vehicles. There's a lot of very high rates of disabilities that affects mobility issues. And then we start seeing some horrific health disparities. Like people living in Ward 2, this ward, majority white wards are living, up to 16 years longer, have 16-year longer life expectancies than Ward 7 and 8. And then Ward, 8 residents are 5 times more likely to die from diabetes than, let's say, like Ward 3 residents. So you start seeing that there's this correlation between race and access to grocery stores and what's happening, in geography. And so we, some people, within the last decade or so, they've been really analyzing this. And one of them was Jerry Shannon. She wrote, she wrote about this idea called supermarket redlining and how supermarkets were, how they were deciding where to, where to keep stores, but also where to build new stores. And she wrote, supermarket redlining resists framing disparities in access to healthy foods as just a side effect of an otherwise functional market or some natural urban ecology, as a bug in the system, so to speak. Rather, it highlights how the locational decisions of food retailers are evidence of intentional disinvestments in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. So people started realizing that this food desert just wasn't really, capturing what was happening. It was kind of like it was capturing a need, but it wasn't really capturing why there was a need in the first place. So that's when, just in, like, say, in the last 5 years or so, people are have been working on this new approach called food apartheid. And so the actual word apartheid apartheid are policies and systems of segregation or discrimination on grounds of race. So this, people have been doing apartheid, policies for a long time, but it really was in South Africa in the 80s with the apartheid government that word apartheid really started catching on. But and in South Africa, they had specific laws that were that were made to discriminate against Black people. And then we see this, all over the world. I know this is a touchy issue, and I know whether which side you're on, objectively speaking. Like if you look at Palestine and Israel, there's a database that tracks Israeli laws that focus specifically on Palestinians discriminating and disenfranchising, and they found over 60 laws that are directly affecting them. So those laws are apartheid laws. And then, I know in America, we kind of sell this this myth that, we used to be apartheid. We had things like Jim Crow laws and stuff that specifically, attacked, people of color, discriminated against people of color. But we sell this myth that in the 60s we fixed all that and now everything's okay. But what we're gonna kind of dive into a little bit today is how that never really got fixed. It never really got dismantled. It just kind of transformed into, converted into different, other systems that are a little less, a little bit harder to identify. So, using that framework of apartheid, we've been, developing different, approaches to kind of understanding food insecurity. And there's three, I think, really three great activists I'm going to read three of these quotes that have helped kind of identify what's going on. So Karen Washington from Rise and Root Farm wrote, "What I would rather say instead of food desert is food apartheid, because food apartheid looks at the whole system along with race, geography, faith, and economics. You say food apartheid and you get to the root cause of some of the problems around the food system. It brings us to the more important question: what are some of the social inequities that you see, and what are you doing to erase some of those injustices?" And then Leah Penniman, she's the director of Soul Fire Farm. It's a really awesome farm up in New York. She does all kinds of awesome food justice workshops and advocacies and things like that. So she wrote, "Food apartheid is a human-created system of segregations, which relegates some people to food opulence and other people to food scarcity. It results in an epidemic of diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and other diet-related illnesses that are plaguing communities of color." And the last advocate, she's Toni Lawson. She's actually from DC and lives in Ward 8 and works a lot with different organizations like DC Greens on different like local advocate programs. And she wrote, "Now we're calling it food deserts. What it is, it's food apartheid. It's something that's planned. A desert is natural. It's manufactured by the planet. This is planned and it's obvious." So a lot of this, kind of counters this idea that food deserts is kind of like this idea that, think it's just a natural thing. This is just like a mistake in the system, that we can fix just like bringing more food. But food apartheid realizes that this isn't a mistake. This is how the system is was intended to work out. These racial disparities are what the system intended to actually do. All right, so so now we're going to kind of dive a little bit into kind of the histories of what we mean about like looking at the past systems and how that created our current realities. And this is a really fantastic book, Black Food Geographies by Shanti Reese. She's a doctor in I think North Carolina University, and she came up here a little while ago to do her thesis. Where she went to Deanwood. Deanwood's in Ward 7, a predominantly Black community in Ward 7, and she analyzed Deanwood over and did a lot of oral histories and interviewed a lot of people that lived all their lives in Deanwood and found about a century ago, Deanwood right now is a very food insecure neighborhood. It doesn't have much access to grocery stores or anything like that. Very high, health, diet related health illnesses and things like that. But she found like a century ago that it was completely opposite. Deanwood was actually a very food secure, Black neighborhood. They had lots of, different, access to food. They had like I think something like, a dozen different community grocery stores. They had, markets. They had, farm, connections with local farmers that would bring the produce in on wagons. They had, everyone grew their own food. It was a very food secure neighborhood. And then, so the idea, which you kind of researched a little bit, or what she focused on was that over the past century, what happened? What are all the things that happened that kind of, caused these food insecurities over this past century? So she talks a little bit about it and does a lot of great oral histories and stuff. Really fantastic book. But we're going to dive a little bit into, the past century and all the different things that have kind of caused those food insecurities. So we're going to start with just going back to the early 1900s. Just understanding what the realities were. So there was a lot of different forms of segregation. Like in the South, it was de jure segregation, or it was legal segregation, like Jim Crow, where they legally said Black people couldn't do this or that. But then there was a lot of de facto segregation in the North. So this was where you couldn't get, Black people couldn't get home loans, redlining. They couldn't get, home loans in certain areas. They couldn't, move into certain white communities. There was very few places they could move to. And Deanwood was actually one of them. It actually used to be this big white farm, or it was a big farm owned by white farmers, but somehow, yeah, they got it talks in this Black food geography to talk the history of it, like someone, when the main farmer died, he broke it up among his daughters who eventually couldn't maintain it, so they ended up selling a bunch of it, and that's when Black people started buying up land in the area and basically turned it into a Black community, one of the few Black communities in DC that they could live in. And so they had that, but at the same time, I mean, they had some really great self-sufficiencies, not because of, but despite of, the fact that they were left out of everything else in the city. I mean, there was so much segregation at the time that they couldn't, access a lot of, different markets and things like that. So they had to create their own, food, self-sufficiencies. And they created their own community markets and their own, community grocery stores, and they grew their own food. And that was working really well in the early 1900s, up until basically the creation, the industrialization of our food system, and started in like the 30s and 40s and 50s. Big one was the rise of supermarkets. So at the time, all the grocery stores were these small, kind of mom and pop grocery stores, and then Safeway, comes in, one of the first ones to come into DC, and they start opening up these like large, grocery stores, and at that time, I mean, like, it kind of ran out all the local stores. The local stores couldn't really compete. One, they had, the industrialization of agriculture in the 40s and 50s. They were, they're aggregating everything. They were processing, everything. They were making like a lot of unhealthy food, but very cheap, unhealthy food. TV dinners and processed food and things like that, which at the time, was, sounded great. It was cheap and quick, but, we know now, the health effect, it had some really bad health effects on communities. But, so these big stores come in and they kind of run out all the local stores, the local markets, but no one really cared though. It wasn't a huge deal because they can, they got everything they needed from these supermarkets. And that was working, pretty well for a while, until we had what's called white flight. So white flight, we when we teach about white flight in our schools, we always teach about how it's like a bunch of individual decisions, a bunch of white people getting scared because Black people were moving in their communities, so they all moved out to the suburbs, and I mean that was a part of it, particularly around school systems and things like that. But what white flight really was what the main part of what it was, it could not happen without this. White flight was a massive federal investment into white people, into white home ownership, particularly, called the New Deal. And the New Deal, so this was FDR's New Deal that came about during the Great Depression. They, in order to actually, the three things that we were always taught about the New Deal is one, there was this focus on getting people out of the Great Depression in three different ways. One is it had a lot of social safety nets, like Social Security and different things like that. Two, it had a lot of workers' rights, right to unionize, child labor laws, different, laws like that. And then the third one was home ownership. FDR realized that, one way to really get people out of poverty and create a middle class was to get them, have them own a home. That's one of the fastest ways, and still today is one of the fastest way to kind of accrue generational wealth. And at that time, it was pretty hard to own a home. Like they used to have some insurances on bank loans, but all that went away during the Great Crash and the Great Depression. So basically, for a bank to give you a loan, to buy a house, you had to like put up half of the loan up front, and then had to pay the rest of it. Pay the rest of it off in like 5 years, 3 to 5 years, which, only rich people were basically buying homes at this time. So, FDR wanted to create, make loans much more affordable, so he created the Federal Housing Association, which basically backed, banking loans, and much like the system that we have today, where, people could buy homes for a small down deposit and then have like 30 years to pay off the loan. And then not only like did he back the loans of the Federal Housing Association, but it also, pumped a lot of money into building new homes for people over, several decades. But in order to actually pass this legislation, they had to find a way to exclude basically mainly Black people. And that's mainly because of, at the time, so we really don't teach this this era very well. It's called the Reconstruction. So Reconstruction was this like decade after the Civil War, when they were trying to figure out if they wanted to actually make things right, or if they wanted to maintain white supremacy. And there was a brief moment like radical Reconstruction where, like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus, and all those people, they passed like the 14th and 15th Amendment, all these like civil rights bills, but ultimately they're radical. They were trying to, 40 acres and a mule. They were trying to basically do reparations. But that was worked great for about 5 or 6 years. But then basically white supremacy took back over. White terrorism took over. They stopped Black people from voting. They got through like terrorism, through voter suppression, through basically return of white supremacy. They took back over. Basically, the old Confederate government took back over the South, and basically ran it. It was basically white supremacy for the next century, up until the mid 1900s. And so that these are particularly in the like Dixiecrats, Strom Thurmond, all those people. So they basically opposed, the South opposed during this time, right after Reconstruction up until the mid 60s. They opposed any kind of civil rights bill, anything that helped Black people, or helped desegregation, civil rights, things like that. So in order to actually FDR, and I say FDR, I don't know if it was FDR or someone in his administration or who did this, but they really realized that in order to pass this bill, they had to find clever ways to exclude Black people to get the South to actually vote with them. So they how they got excluded Black people from the social safety nets and from labor rights is they excluded the two industries that most Black people worked in. So they excluded farm workers and they excluded domestic workers. And that was like, at that time, was the majority of Black people worked in those two industries. So they, that was a clever way to, exclude most Black people from Social Security benefits and labor protections. But to exclude Black people from Federal Housing Association or to home loans, because at the time they couldn't. There was a bunch of civil, Supreme Court cases that prevented the government from legally discriminating against a racial group around housing. But it was still, at the time, it was very legal for private industries like real estate industries to exclude Black people, and they very much did. That was like written into their code of conduct, where that if like real estate agents didn't want to exclude, they can actually lose their license. So the government hired these people to create risk assessment maps for every city in the country, every municipality, and essentially what they did is they basically they did a color coordinated map, and it was completely based on just basically race. It was like, if you're all white section, you got like blue, and that meant you're good to go with a loan, and if your community was like starting to turn more of a community, more Black Indigenous people of color were moving in there, then they it started getting riskier, and then Black communities got the red color, and they were just completely excluded from home loans, and that's what we call redlining, where that came from. And that so basically they created that, and that gave them the ability to exclude Black people from like majority of home loans for like the next 30 years. From like I think it was 1934, from the Federal Housing Association started, to 1968 when the Fair Housing Act outlawed redlining, even though it still occurred for another decade, and in many ways it occurs de factoly still to this day. But between that 30-year period between 1934 and 68, 98% of home loans went to white people. And that's an enormous amount of wealth. I mean, that's one of the biggest ways that we accrue wealth and we pass wealth. I mean, we can take some of that wealth and send people to college, and we can, deal with emergencies. That's, enormous amount of wealth. And that's like, I always, in my classes, I tell people to think think about, like if we had done that today, like what that would look like. Imagine, like, we had that '08 recession, the Great Recession. That was a really bad recession. Imagine if our government at the time decided, like a lot of people are suffering, we need to do something. What I'm going to do is I'm going to spend about $1 trillion. I mean, if you look at all the wealth that all the money that was spent on home loans, and also all the money that was spent to build homes, which we'll talk more about in a second. They factor today's value is about $1 trillion. So imagine if our government decided they're going to take $1 trillion and just spend it on white people. We're just going to invest on white home ownership. We're going to help white people build homes. We're going to help them get loans. We're going to help them build whole suburbs. And then we're going to throw in like the GI Bill. We're going to have all this money, billions of dollars to help educate white people. We're going to have like highway loans, highway bills, where we're going to like destroy black communities so we can build highways to these new nice white suburbs. And we're going to do this for 30 years. Again, 30 years we're going to do this. White people are just going to build an enormous amount of wealth. And then after the end of 30 years, we're going to realize that this wasn't right. We shouldn't have done this. And so we're going to pass some civil rights bills that are just basically just going to stop us from continually doing it in the most, explicit way. They're going to keep some windows open for for home loan discrimination, for schools, segregation and things like that. But we're basically just going to, there's not going to be any economic reparations. There's not going to be a Black New Deal. There's not going to be any of that. We're not going to repair past harm. We're just going to stop it, from continuing happening. And then we're going to create up all these ideas that when Black people start complaining about this enormous racial wealth gap and in this horrific segregation they're dealing with, then we're going to tell them it's all their fault and they just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps because white people did it. Why can't they? Or we're going to make up myths about the absent, Black father, or that or something, the culture of poverty, and we're creating up, all these different ideas that it's now Black people causing their own, issues, and we're never going to really talk about what happened in the last 30 years, and we're going to pretend like we fixed everything with our 60 civil rights bills. So going back to white flight, so it wasn't just a bunch of white people moved out to the suburbs. It was a bunch of white people took all this wealth that they accrued during slavery, all this wealth they accrued during Jim Crow, and all this enormous amount of wealth being pumped into them from the federal government, for a 30-year period, and they're going to move all that wealth out to the suburbs, and that where Black people can't follow because now they can't, because of redlining and things and other housing discrimination strategies, they can't actually get home loans, to these new communities that are being built out in the suburbs. So that's not, so it wasn't just that, the bodies moved, it was also enormous amount of wealth moved, and that wealth was, and that was, important. I mean, the majority of the wealth, was in white people's hands. So when they move out to the suburbs, the Black communities that are left over, lost an enormous amount of wealth, and they continue to, after white flight occurs, we have a periods of deindustrialization and disinvestment. So all the industries, because everyone moved to the cities, especially particularly Black people from the South and during World War I and World War II, because there was all these factory jobs, really nice paying factory jobs. But then all these industries decided they wanted to, move with white people. So they start moving out to the suburbs as well and start leaving, Black communities. And then we start seeing this massive, disinvestment period, happening, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, particularly around like Reagan's years and what we call neoliberalism, where they basically just, did enormous cuts into social safety nets, into urban programs, public health programs, all while moving all this, a bunch of funding to, tax breaks to the rich and huge military contracts and to, building a police, to this mass incarceration and war on drugs that they're creating. We don't talk enough about the damage that Reagan's years did to Black communities. I mean, literally Black life expectancy, went down during Reagan's years. I mean, the cuts were so horrific and the homelessness exploded. And this was during the, crack epidemic epidemic as well, and so and they decided to treat it as a policing issue instead of a public health issue, like we're treating the opioid crisis right now. And it's just, it cannot talk, I mean, it's just enough about how destructive that period was for Black communities. And then at the same time, we start, that's when we start seeing that supermarkets, start, realizing that all the wealth, is in white communities at this point. So they start, even though they made all these promises, particularly in DC, they made all these promises to Black communities that we weren't going to leave you. And then they eventually did. And like I think in 1980, like the last, the Safeway and Deanwood left. They talk a lot about that period in this book. So all these, grocery stores leave as well, and that's where we saw, supermarket redlining, where all of a sudden there's no food left over. All the, community grocery stores and markets had been wiped out by these supermarkets, and then the supermarkets got up and left and followed the white people and their wealth. And that's kind of what gets us to today, where we're literally, we have this enormous racial wealth disparity, where we have, the white household has 16 times the wealth of a Black household. And that, I mean, I remember growing up thinking, I was taught that, that we live in a meritocracy, and that, rich people just worked harder, and poor people are just lazy. But in reality, I mean, we sell that myth, but in reality, this is a direct link to our past history. I mean, everyone's got to do, try hard and do their best, but there's at a certain point you have to realize the realities that we've been left with, and that's, that's what created this enormous, racial wealth gap. And now we're also seeing even more like this, just affordable housing crisis, which is causing gentrification and all different things. So and then that's disproportionately hitting Black communities as well, because they've been stuck in this concentrated poverty for the last century. So that's I wanted to kind of that was a quick kind of rundown of all the things that kind of over the last century, that all the major histories that kind of have caused a lot of food insecurities. But I just want to kind of do it all in one slide so people can kind of see how it fits. I mean, this, even though like these things happen in different times, in different, periods, but for the most part, I mean, this happened in the majority of the cities across the country. But now I want to kind of dive a little bit deeper into each one of these as well. All right, so talking a little bit more about segregation, because there was, like we said, there was de jure segregation or legal segregation. That was like Jim Crow. But if I guarantee, if you open up any high school history book about Jim Crow, you go in the glossary, find the page, open it up, you'll see a water fountain. And not to downplay, how, crappy it was that, people had to drink in different water fountains, but that was like the drops in the bucket. I mean, what Jim Crow really was about was about disenfranchising and Black people and Black communities. It was about hospitals, I mean, Black people, if you look at infant mortality rates among Black women in the South during Jim Crow, it'll make you cry. Like, and that wasn't because there wasn't hospitals at that time. It was because most Black people couldn't go to most hospitals because they're only for white people. Things like lynching. Thousands of Black people were lynched. In the South during this period, and we sell this idea, it's because they attacked a white woman or something. But in reality, I mean, it was just it was about enforcing white supremacy and a racial hierarchy. Or removing economic competition, or it was because of Black and white people had a mutual, relationship. But they would have these, most of these lynchings, I mean, a lot of them happen as public events, and they would have, bad photos of hundreds of people, having picnics, surrounding these Black people being tortured to death. And everyone knew who did it, but no one ever got prosecuted because all the juries were all white and all the judges were all white. So they never really prosecuted anyone for lynching during all this entire time period. And that was because of Jim Crow. So they created it, this, it was about, housing, employment, schools, voting, legal protections, all that was being denied to Black people through Jim Crow. And then we call, this another great whitewash term we use is called the Great Migration. That's where between like World War I and World War II, where I think like millions of Black people, migrated from the South to cities in the North and West. In reality, I mean, some people did migrate, but a lot of people escaped. They were internal refugees. They were stuck in these systems where they basically criminalized Black life with all these black codes and Jim Crow laws, and basically, kept people either as, sharecroppers, where they were basically, they had to borrow everything and take loans out, and then they just never paid back the loans. And they were just, it was debt peonage. They were basically enslaved through debt. Or if they tried to escape that, they would, catch them, arrest them, throw them in convict leasing, and that's when they would rent those people out to these, same plantations and farms that used to, mines that used to use slave people, and they would just use criminals, but it's just horrific, mortality rates, because you can get new slaves every month, or new convicts every month. So, I mean, and that was mainly because, the South, like much of this country, we built our economy on exploited labor. And it's particularly around our food systems as well. We still use, exploited labor to this day. It's just more, it's about immigrant, and migrant labor that we exploit instead of, enslaved people. But that was still, but the Southern economy needed these Black people to continue to be exploited. But so they were trying to, leave the South. And then there was like a great book I just read. I can't remember the name of it, but I was talking about, they would be, the KKK would hang out at train stations, and they would, drag people back to, sharecropping, or they would lynch them to make an example, to keep people from escaping. People had to leave in the middle of the night, and so, but eventually millions of Black people did, escape the South, and they they made it to, northern cities, particularly the cities, because that's where a lot of factory jobs were. And especially during the war, we needed labor so much that they were willing to hire Black people, during World War I and World War II. And a lot of Black people thought, because there was no Jim Crow, that things were going to be better in the North and the West. And what they found is it was just as bad. There was, it was, they experienced what we call de facto segregation. And that's where, they couldn't, they couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. They had to live in this, really poor, neighborhoods, rundown neighborhoods. They couldn't get, they had discrimination against jobs and housing and schools, and they had a really vicious racial hierarchy that was enforced by police at the time, and that was. In many ways, it's still being forced by police very brutally. And so, but there was a lot of different ways that, outside of Jim Crow, that people, discriminate against Black people. And I'm not going to talk about all these things, but I want to focus on one thing particular, because this is still a thing that happens everywhere, especially in DC, and it's called exclusionary zoning. So this is basically, the first zoning ordinance was in Baltimore in the early 1900s, and it's basically is a racial zone, and they said only Black people can live in this neighborhood and white people can live in this neighborhood. But that got kicked, it got challenged, and the Supreme Court eventually, turned it down, said it was unconstitutional. But that sparked a whole movement of people that realized that, they can, implement and maintain racial segregation through clever, exclusionary zoning laws. So this became particularly popular. President Hardy, so he put together this commission in 1921 of basically, white supremacist segregationists, openly, segregationists, and they put together a commission. They sent them to like hundreds of cities across the country. And that's where they train people to train governments to create these zoning ordinances. And originally, like, zoning is supposed to be like about public health, and like we put all the industry in one zoning and the housing in another, and it's supposed to be about safety and all that. And that's a big part of zoning, but another big part is they use that, to racially segregate. Like the one they use in they actually said this, if you read Color of Law, they say this openly, that they want to use industrial zoning. They intentionally put industrial zoning in Black communities, because they knew that would lower the property value and that would prevent them from making enough money. And they knew as white communities got richer and richer, eventually, even because they kind of realized that, eventually they couldn't racially segregate people by law. So they realized that if they create enough wealth in white communities, that Black people would never, even when it was legal, could not, ever move into these white communities, which is basically kind of what happened. But the same, they also came up with these like really, tricky ones or clever ones, like single family units. Or density laws, and that was all about, they would claim it's about keeping the facade of the communities, like the style of the communities. They want to just, have, single family units, not like, apartment complexes. But in reality, I mean, most affordable housing are, multi-units, are apartment complexes. So what they're using, they use this to basically keep, affordable housing and keep any opportunity for Black people to move into their communities. And I'm going to show you a map of DC's affordable housing in a slide later. And then it's basically, I mean, it's the reason why, there's no affordable housing west of Rock Creek Park. And that's because they all have single family unit zoning, and it's all concentrated, east of the river or some in the middle of a city. And you think about, that at first that seems right, let's put affordable housing in the poorest communities. But in fact, that's actually the opposite of what's supposed to happen, because that concentrates poverty into this small area, and that even puts even bigger burden on schools and economic opportunities, and actually creates more poverty by putting all the affordable housing in the poor communities. What you want is, you want to decentralize affordable housing. You want to have it spread around the city so people can access other resources. Because really, like, segregation, it's not, it's not so much about diversity, it's about resources. It's about who has the good schools, the good hospitals, the good jobs, and that is all divided geographically. So it's not just about let's integrate everyone, diversity. There's actually, there's actually good times that we want to be, there's actually good examples, like having like Black spaces and stuff, and like is important, can actually be a powerful thing. But so it's not just about diversity, it's just about sharing resources. And if you look, even today, there's a study came out last year that white schools receive 23 billion more a year than non-white schools. That's 733 per student. So these schools and these white communities are have so much more resources, and those kids are going to have so much more of a better chance of succeeding than kids in the Black schools. So that's what segregation is about. It's about it's about segregating actual resources from communities. And the big part, as well, is white people are the most. I read this the other day. White people are the most racially segregated people in this country. We are living in a white bubble. Like 75% of white people don't have a friend of color in their group, or if they do, they don't have someone that's going to be honest with them about racism and white privilege. And that directly affects the way we see the world as well. 55% of white people, there's this study that found that, and I've actually seen this in multiple studies, that the white people, there's just a simple majority of white people believe that they are discriminated against just as much, if not more, than Black people. And that has everything to do with the fact that we're in these white bubbles, and we can't see what's, we're segregated from the actual negative realities of our country. But anyway, so this is actually a map of Deanwood. So these are all the grocery stores and markets and stuff that was in the early 1900s, up until like the 50s and 60s, until most of these were wiped out by. But during this this era of segregation, these Black communities were popping up, and a lot of them were very successful. But unfortunately, some of the most successful ones were destroyed, like Tulsa and other Greenwood and other places, or I agree, space in the, so a lot of these Black communities actually were massacred because of their success as well. So, but Deanwood was a very successful community for a while, and then we saw, instead of being massacred, we saw this slow kind of destruction, over the last century. And then, like we said, in the 30s and 40s and 50s, we start seeing this explosion of supermarkets. In the 1950s, most food retail was 30. Supermarkets were 35% of food retail. And in a decade later, they were 70%. And at the same time, we saw this rise in industrial agriculture, where we just saw, it was cheaper food, and more food, but it was at such a huge cost to like animals, to workers' rights, to the planet, to the environment, to public health. So we were creating this cheap system of food that had enormous consequences. But at the same time, no one knew that at the time. So everyone embraced it. TV dinners came out in the 50s. I'm sure, if I was like, stay at home parent and I saw TV dinners, I'd be super excited, about that. That's all we would be eating. But eventually we noticed, it was a huge, public health, negative impact from all this stuff. And then white flight and redlining. I won't read all of this stuff. A lot of this stuff, I can share these slides with you all if you want to dive a little bit deeper in a lot of these things. I really recommend this book, Color of Law. If you haven't read it, it's just an amazing, amazing book. It talks about the last century of just housing discrimination, particularly around redlining. But it talks a lot about like public housing as well was segregated, from the get-go, and it was very concentrated in these poor neighborhoods. And they built high rises and things like that. That mainly, again, it seemed like it was a good idea, but mainly just concentrated poverty. And they were building more and more public housing. At the same time, they were sponsoring redlining. So the government was throwing billions at white people to build their own homes and own their own homes. But then they were building, at first it was nice housing, but then they, by the 1950s, they started seriously disinvesting in public housing, and then that's when we're entering the crisis that we are right now, where like in DC, over a dozen, most of our public housing was built in the 40s and 50s, but like over a dozen of the public housing complexes have been deemed livable right now, and no one's got the funds to kind of build them back up. So it's basically that's where a lot of that came from this public housing that was just basically, all concentrated into these poor, communities of color, just to concentrate that poverty. But and then the GI Bill came, and that was tons more money for education, for returning vets, but it was just for white people, for home loans. It had all this funds to actually build whole communities. Like they built giant suburbs with federal funds. This was one in Leamington, Pennsylvania. But the thing was, is the government would only give you these billions of dollars or whatever to build, or millions of dollars to build these communities, if you sign an agreement saying you wouldn't allow black people to live in them. So what they had to do, they had to agree to do what's called racial covenants, which were deeds that basically said that only white people can own, and you can only sell this house or rent this house to white people. So they had, in order to get the funding to build these huge communities, they had to agree to all that stuff. And then, as we talked about, between 34 and 68, 98% of home loans were given to white people. Just between 34 and 64, over $120 billion was pumped into, building white homes in communities for white people. At the peak, the Federal Housing Association financed 80% of all private home construction. And as we look at, like the majority of the wealth, that we pass down generation to generation is through home ownership. It's a huge amount of wealth. So that really built not only the racial segregation that we're living in, but the racial wealth gaps that we're dealing with as well. And then we had that period in deindustrialization and disinvestment. So a big part of this was, well, not only did all the money leave, majority of the wealth in the country was in white people's hands. So when they left to the suburbs, they took all that wealth with them. But then the city started disinvesting, and the industry started moving out. And that's the point where at the time, so we started seeing all these what we call urban redevelopment projects. So that was basically a couple of federal highway acts in the 1950s and 60s that offered, so we're seeing all these like poor communities, they're being disinvested in, these urban black communities. What they would do is they would call them, they had a code word called blighted. They would call them blighted. Not to say, most of these communities needed help. They needed investment, but they would use that word blighted to say that it was like beyond repair. And then they would offer up 90% of the cost costs of redevelopment costs, the federal government, for any city in the country to basically just bulldoze everything and rebuild it as a white community or as a highway, giving access to a new white suburb. So this happened in hundreds of different, communities across the country. We were one of the first ones to happen in our Southwest waterfront. And this is really awful because at the time we didn't have a local government. We didn't get our a home rule to 1980s. So it was basically just like a commission. Like 3 people ran our entire city. And they were hand selected by basically Southern politicians, like Dixiecrats so they, without even asking anybody, they just, kicked out. There was something like 20,000, Black people lived in this area. There was like 1,500 businesses. I mean, it definitely could have used investments, and improvements, but it was a thriving community that was basically bulldozed, and then highways were built, and then fancy high-rise, fancy buildings, and basically, I mean, everyone got booted. No one got, from what I understand, no one really got compensation, or maybe some people might have gotten compensation, but I mean, it wasn't much. And then they were basically dumped into these like new giant public high rises and public, housing complexes, east of a river and already in poor neighborhoods. And that happened all over. That's with like Chicago high rises and all this stuff. A lot of these public housing high rises were built to basically just dump people that from communities that were being redeveloped. And then again, I'm gonna read this quote about public housing. So this is really starting in the 1950s. Like before the 50s, public housing was a really great thing. And then I'll just read this quote. One explanation for the failure of federal housing policies to actually produce fair housing is it found in the state's continued reliance on the private sector as the sole provider of housing in the United States. The federal government long ago abdicated the responsibility of directly producing affordable housing instead of outsourcing the task to private developers while continuing to provide vast amounts of assistance in the form of guarantees, subsidies, and tax relief. As a result, it has absorbed the real estate and vacant industry's historic embrace of racial discrimination. So in the 50s, there were some highway bills that were housing bills that were passed, and basically real estate lobbyists and developers kind of they got in all this stuff that basically allowed for the public housing to be defunded, and then because there wasn't any funds, they had to turn to private industries to kind of take over, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. We're still seeing that today, where we're having to basically give up our public housing to private entities, private developers, because we can't afford to repair it anymore. And then we saw, again, like with the neoliberal disinvestments, there's a lot of words like planned shrinkage, municipal disinvestment, benign neglect. This happened in South Bronx, Harlem, Boston, New Orleans. When they say the Bronx is burning, that was basically because they completely disinvested into the Bronx area. After white flight, everyone moved out. Well, white people moved out, and they just completely disinvested to the point that people were, there wasn't even, fire departments anymore to put out fires. And there's actually a whole movie, a bunch of movies that came out, but a new one just came out about that, The Bronx is Burning. And it's a pretty powerful movie. At the same time, we had Reagan, neoliberal disinvestments. We see like HUD, housing, urban development, get budget slash, public health budgets, social safety nets were slashed, and we see that continue. Especially with HUD, we see a continuation of disinvestment with every president since then. And then we had supermarket redlining. So phenomenon when major chain supermarkets are disinclined to locate their stores in the inner cities or low income neighborhoods and usually pull their existing stores out and relocate them to suburbs. And then we start seeing this enormous racial wealth gap. Again, we're 16 times, white people have 16 times the median wealth of Black households. And that's when they say median wealth, it's like we take all your assets and all your debts and you subtract it, and then what you're left with it is what we're talking about with wealth. At the same time, we see this enormous amount of housing discrimination by affordability. So I'm gonna read this from Color of Law. 70 years ago, many working in lower middle class African-American families could have afforded suburban single family homes that cost about $75,000 in today's currency with no down payment. Millions of whites did so, but working in lower middle class African-American families cannot buy homes for $350,000 or more with down payments of 20% or $70,000. The Fair Housing Act in 1968 prohibited future discrimination but it was not primarily discrimination, although this still contributed that kept African Americans out of most white suburbs after the law was passed. It's primarily on affordability. The advantages that FHA and VA loans gave the white lower middle class in the 1940s and 50s have become permanent. So that's the idea now that we kind of like, you know, Black people, I mean, they could have afforded, you know, a lot of these houses, you know, in these white, you know, communities back in the 40s and 50s when there was only $70,000, but now they can't afford it, you know, and we say, oh, well, now it's like the free market, you know, it's not racism, it's free market. But I mean, that whole racial wealth gap and that whole affordability, the unaffordability was created through a history of racism and racist policies. And then now we're experiencing what we call an affordable housing crisis, where we have, you know, the incomes have remained stagnant since the 70s, basically combinations of a lot of things, from the decline of unions to minimum wage laws and that haven't been raised in like forever, to a whole bunch of other things. So despite the fact that our productivity has been, you know, going through the roof since the 70s, our wages have basically stayed the same, which with inflation rates, you know, basically has probably decreased. So that's happening as rents are still rising. You know, prices of home ownership and rents are rising, and at the same time, our government programs are being more defunded and slashed. So we're seeing a huge epidemic of affordable housing, where millions of families do not have affordable housing, and millions of people, or 500,000 people, are homeless throughout any given day. And that happens a lot with, so we have a lot of affordable housing. So we have all these affordable housing programs, but we designed them to not, you know, sometimes, you know, some of them are good, but a lot of them aren't really designed to help people that need them the most. A big part, so affordable housing is based on the idea that there's a general idea that you should only be spending 30% of your income on housing, and then you're spending the rest on, you know, the things you need and saving some and stuff like that. But if you're spending more than 30%, you're overburdened or rent burden. And they figured out, you know, when they set rates at affordable housing, they calculate the area median income of the area. It's called AMI. And then they set it at, you know, typically around 30% of AMI is the rate. But our AMI is not just DC. It also includes all these rich suburbs outside of DC. So that really pushed up the AMI in our area to the point that our AMI, our average median income, is 117,000, which is close, you know, which is kind of real for white families. White families on average in this area make 127,000, but Black families on average make 37,000. So they're not even anywhere close to AMI. So, but they're still using 117,000 as the AMI for everyone in this area. So then they take 30% of that, which is basically everything that Black families are making. You know, it's all they got, you know, to make that. So they can't afford, you know, affordable housing. So a lot of affordable housing that's being built, a lot of poor Black people can't afford. You know, actually a lot of people, if you're making minimum wage, 15 an hour, you can't afford it. You know, if you're, it's pretty crazy. And if you look, this is a map of actually all of our affordable housing units. And if you notice, there's none of them in west of Rock Creek. And that's because of the single family, you know, ordinances, single family unit ordinances, density laws and stuff. I mean, they purposely have made sure that, that you can't build affordable housing, you know, still to this day. You know, we like to say we got rid of all these racist policies, but I mean, we haven't. We just kind of made them seem not racist, you know, but the outcome is still very racist. So then we have most of our affordable housing is in the poor neighborhoods, and that's just concentrating that poverty. Yeah. And then last thing I want to talk about before we start talking about solutions, start talking about, is gentrification as well. So gentrification, I'm going to read this quote from National Community Reinvestment Coalition. So gentrification is a powerful force for economic change in our cities, but is often accompanied by extreme and unnecessary cultural displacement. While gentrification increases the values of properties in areas that suffer from prolonged disinvestment, it also results in rising rents, home and property values. As these rising costs reduce the supply of affordable housing, and existing residents who are often Black or Hispanic are displaced. This prevents them from benefiting from the economic growth and greater availability of services that come with increased investment. Gentrification presents a challenge to communities that are trying to achieve economic revitalizations without the disruption that comes with displacement. And that's important to understand. It's like gentrification doesn't necessarily mean just, revitalization. We can definitely invest into communities and build communities without, gentrifying them. We just have to be very intentional about it. We have to have, rent controls. We have to have, affordable housing policies. We have to, we have to build for the community that is there right now, not for a richer, white community that's going to come later. And then we don't do that. We don't, really do that at all. So we kind of just build to try to get as many people and as many higher income people as possible in DC, and that's causing a massive amount of gentrification and displacement, to the point that the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, they did a study in 2013, and they found that DC was the highest gentrifying city in the country. They found that almost every major city was experiencing some form of gentrification, but they found DC was the highest when it comes to like displacement, and just the effects of gentrification in the area. Like something like 20,000 Black residents have, directly been displaced, but then there's an indirect displacement where, maybe you have a rent controlled building, but you watch all your friends and family and your support systems and stuff get displaced, and then eventually you self-displace yourself because you can't, so that even, adds way more than 20,000. And to understand like gentrification, well, we have to understand, there's been multiple phases of gentrification in DC. Basically people, if you read some of these, I recommend if you live in DC, you should read Chocolate City and Capital Dilemma. These are amazing books about the history of DC. But they talk about how there's been 4 phases. The first phase was Georgetown in the early 1900s. The second was like Foggy Bottom in like the 40s or something like that. And then Columbia Heights in maybe like the 70s or 80s. But this is the 4th phase that we're going through. And then what makes it so powerful is like majority of the city, like over half of the city right now is experiencing some form of gentrification. It's not just like, to one area. And to really understand gentrification, because we sell this idea when we talk about gentrification. This is very intentional. We talk about how it's just a bunch of hipsters and coffee shops and stuff like that. And I don't want to downplay like, we all, we're all a part of this. We all can make decisions every day to either help or hurt this. We need to be conscious about this and do our part. And at the same time, we need to understand that gentrification is really about local policies. It's about local governments deciding which people they want to invest into and which people they don't want to invest into. And that's really what gentrification is about. Which if we could talk about what started this latest phase of gentrification, we really need to understand how much it sucks to not be a state. DC, because we're not a state, we got in our home rule in I believe the 1980s, and then but it was conditional. There were some conditions to that. Well, one, we weren't a state. We didn't have the powers of the state. Two, we weren't allowed to do things that states could do, like particularly around raising economic, funding sources, like a commuter tax. So, like, I don't know how many, but I'm just going to guess like tens of thousands, if not like 100,000 people, come into DC to work from Virginia and Maryland. And those people don't pay any taxes because normally most cities, they would charge a commuter tax, or they actually would, charge them some kind of tax that can actually pay for, roads and all the things that they use. We're not allowed to do that. So we're missing out on a huge amount of tax revenue from our commuters. At the same time, a lot of our city is federal land, federal buildings and national parks and stuff. So that's we can't raise taxes on that. So we really, since the get-go, we've had our hands tied behind with balancing the budget, and that really came to came to fruition, or it really exploded in the early 1990s when DC actually they went bankrupt. And then the federal government came in, they took over. It was, they initiated super harsh austerity, I can't say that word, policies, but they cut down, cut all different kinds of social services and things, particularly on Black communities. It was a very painful time. But then after about, I think it was for 5 years, they balanced the budget, and eventually they gave it back to DC in early 2001. But there was this big, strong recommendation from economists, from the federal government, even from like the DC government during like one of their first mayors was Anthony Williams. Basically the recommendation was you needed to attract a lot more people to DC, because DC had lost a lot, of people in the last couple of decades. A lot of it from crime, and just from a general disinvestment. People were moving out, especially after the 68 Fair Housing Act, when suddenly they were allowed to kind of move out, and the few people that could afford to move, did, which even hurt the tax base even worse. But then, so Mayor Anthony Williams, realized, that he needed to attract more people, not just like anyone though. They call this the creative class. It was basically it's a clever word for basically middle to upper class white person that could bring trendy businesses and could do things that would attract more people and build a stronger tax base. So he had a policy to attract 100,000 creative class residents. So he focused a lot of the budget on developments that would attract people to certain communities. Tax breaks for big developers. At the same time, he was kind of continuing this disinvestment in poor Black communities, particularly around housing, and like affordable housing and public housing was being disinvested while we were investing all this money into attracting new people to come in, that was going to bring was going to raise the tax base. And that's basically what happened over that period. And we saw a massive amount of displacement, affordable housing. At the same time, we're seeing rapid gentrification and a lot of new people moving in as well. There's actually a lawsuit from a DC housing advocate, Aristotle Theresia. He's an amazing advocate. He speaks a lot with like some of the housing organizations we're going to talk about in a second. If you can catch him speaking, it's really powerful. But he's actually sued the government, claiming that the government specifically discriminated against Black residents as they were trying to bring white professionals in, which is going to be really hard because to prove, because our court systems are based on like discrimination is based on proof of malice. Like you literally have to have like a video of you, like or a signed paper saying you intended to hurt Black people, which is it's crazy. Like we don't look at outcomes, we only look at intent in our justice departments. And so, but anyway, I think it's just powerful that it's happening. If you look at this, like the map of like where most of the gentrification really hit hard was like in this like Ward 4 and the Columbia Heights and down in Southwest. But if you want to read more, I definitely check out Chocolate City and Capital Dilemma. They're really fantastic books. And then, so we mainly talked about today, we talked about like spatial discrimination and how that affected, but really like how that affects food insecurity. But really, we could do whole classes on all different kinds of things, from colonialism to failure, Reconstruction, Black land theft, like criminal justice system. A big one is like the rise of the modern Republican Party in the 50s and 60s. Created itself out of opposing segregation and civil rights bills, and they kind of reconfigured a lot of racism where to these more socially acceptable, what we call dog whistles, where instead of like saying like outright racist things, you say things like states' rights and law and order. And like law and order was created by Nixon as an excuse to crack down and brutalize civil rights advocates. So there's like illegals is a big one, and things. So there's a lot of these things that, although they they don't seem racist, the outcomes are they're pushing racist policies, and that had a direct effect for a lot of food insecurity in Black communities, specifically around ever since LBJ Society opened up the New Deal policies like welfare and different programs. That's been a target of these racial dog whistles, talking about welfare queens and pushing this idea that Black people are abusing these systems, to kind of, create this animosity to win over white voters. But if you really want to understand a lot more of that, this is a fantastic book, Dog Whistle Politics. Really, really powerful book. It talks about the rise of the Republican Party in the 50s and 60s, which for a party that controls majority of our government, we don't really teach the history of how it came along. But we could talk about mass incarceration. We could talk a whole bunch of different things. We could talk about patriarchy. We could talk about capitalism. But we just kind of focused on spatial racism for this class. But all right, so now now that I talked about a lot of depressing things, now we're going to talk about kind of solutions. So my hope isn't that I depress everyone, but kind of motivate people. And then we're going to talk about all the different things that we can do and get involved with in DC to kind of counteract a lot of these things. The first one is to build food sovereignty. So food sovereignty, La Viva Campesina talks about this. They talk about the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. So that's the big one, is about people owning their food systems, owning their choices, not just us being like, here's some food, you guys are food insecure, here's some food, like it or leave it. It's more about them building, us, kind of erasing the causes of these food insecurities and building their own natural food systems, like culturally appropriate food systems, and sustainable food systems, ones that treat animals and land and people right. So a lot of organizations are trying to do this in DC right now. For Dreaming Out Loud, the Arc Farm, DC Urban Greens. But a big approach about doing this kind of work is having what we call a community first approach. Not just coming in as like the white savior and being like, I know what you guys need. I want to get a bunch of grants that's going to go through me. It's kind of going the opposite route. It's believing that these communities know what they need. Helping them out. Giving them community ownership. Community designs, buy-ins. And allowing them to helping them get the resources to build their own projects and their own food systems, and really being aware of gatekeeping. Majority of the funds that are supposed to go to core black communities are often siphoned by white nonprofits, and then they get to decide how it's been spent in the community. So a lot of this is about trying to get these grants and these funds into black organizations, local black organizations in black communities. So that's a big part. But a lot of this is about building, we're essentially building local food economies in a lot of these communities. We're not just building farms, we're growing food, but we're also working on distribution networks, cold storage. If you don't have a place to store your crops before the market, they're not going to be good for the market. Value added processing places, how we can create whole meals, not just selling people vegetables, but also creating whole healthy meals and products out of it. Entrepreneurship, affordable markets, community composting. So we have a bunch of organizations that are working on this. They're trying to build out every step of the economy. Like I said, Dreaming Out Loud is a big one. We just built a 2-acre farm in Ward 7, and they're not only growing a bunch of food, but they're also working with local kitchens and they're doing training programs, entrepreneurship programs, and they're trying to help people create livable jobs from this food. And they're also working on, cold storage and supply chains and things like that. Fresh Food Factory, opened up in Anacostia, and they, it's a healthy grocery store that sells a lot, mainly, not everything, not totally, but a lot of locally produced, items. So we're trying to build, markets, as well. A big part is we're trying to build community business incubators, spaces, like commercial incubator spaces, so people can actually start their, businesses. So it's not it's super expensive to rent out kitchens. There are, private, incubator spaces, but those can be kind of costly as well, and it can be long, hurdles to get into. So we're working on, based off, there's a lot of great nonprofit incubator spaces like Community Crossroads, Community Kitchen in Tacoma, DC Bilingual Kitchen, Martha's Table. So we're actually working, I work for DC Parks and Rec, and we're working on building incubator spaces at rec centers, because we have 50 rec centers, all over the city in every community. So we're actually, we're planning our first one next year, Congress Heights. in Ward 8. And we have right now, I mean, it's pending the final decision, but in the designs, and the community's voted on this, that we're going to have some kind of, 1,500 square foot community kitchen incubator spaces where, for free, local businesses can come in and do, develop their business and develop their products. And at the same time, we're also working on markets, that will actually take, sell these items. It's not just about bringing in Walmarts. It's about bringing in like community-owned grocery stores. Kind of how a lot of this was back in the early 1900s. So part of Congress Heights is we actually have a 500 square foot grocery store that we're going to be working with a nonprofit called Community Grocery Co-op. It's a nonprofit in Ward 8 that's trying to do a food co-op. So we're going to do food co-ops where people can actually get healthy foods for affordable prices. And a lot of this too is about, targeted funding, actually making sure the funding, goes to these communities that need it. So there's a lot of great initiatives lately. Washington Area Community Investment Fund, DC Small Business, development, they're producing a lot of targeted funding. And I believe, last I heard, I mean, there was like, at least 2 or 3 grocery stores that are hopefully going to be opening up in east of the river in the next couple of years, based on these funding initiatives. If you work with a program that finances and funds and makes grants into these projects, definitely check out this resource guide. It's called In Deep Initiative. It's all about, making sure your money actually goes to organizations, local Black-run organizations in these Black communities. And a lot of it's about community advocacy training, like DC Greens and DC Fair Budgets that train a lot of these people. We saw Tony Lawson was actually trained by DC Greens to be a community advocate through these programs. And they did things like grocery walk, where they had thousands of people walk, like the I think it was like a mile that most residents in Ward 8 have to walk to go to the grocery store. And a lot of this is just about learning about, that what is out there. There's so many in DC, there's so many amazing jobs and grants and programs and things, but most people don't ever hear about it. So that's one initiative we've been trying to do, is we created the Doug Network that, where we do twice a month, we do this long, exhaustive, but ugly, but resource newsletter where it's like, there's like a dozen, or so jobs every 2 weeks. There's grants, there's all these opportunities to kind of build, that a lot of people don't hear about. So we're trying to get more and more people, and we, on board with this and trying to, bring transparency to all the resources in this community. And then a lot of people talk about, well, what can I do individually, and so I wrote down this list of just things that we can do. The first one is, hopefully everyone's realizing like the consequences right now of calling the cops when they're not absolutely needed. So I really recommend that everyone create what's called an alternative to calling the cops plan. You could download ones for DC. They have on community mediation numbers. They have mental health numbers. I mean, the idea is that you try everything out, and like the cops are only the last resort, and that's only if there's direct harm to you or someone else. And that's at the same time understanding that a lot of white people have, internalized unconscious racial bias where they perceive harm when there's not. So at the same time, we need to, we're working on, our racial bias as well, so we're not perceiving harm when there's not harm. But general idea is like when you see something, it's not that you're like, oh, what should I do? You should have this printed out and posted on your refrigerator of all the different things that you can do, all the numbers you can try, talk to your neighbors. A lot of neighbors who especially been around in the neighborhood for generations are really good at talking to people that that can calm people down better than calling the cops. Where the cops are just here for just to control unsafe situations. They're not supposed to be social workers. They're not supposed to be all these people that they're not, and that's what's causing a lot of negative outcomes from calling the cops. And also knowing like the ICE emergency hotline. So when you see ICE and immigration agents in your neighborhood, calling that line and giving everyone a heads up as well is huge. And that's really important, especially like as these communities are gentrifying. We're seeing a lot of friction in these gentrifying neighborhoods, and a lot of this is around calling the cops. And then, and then financially supporting volunteering, amplifying different, organizations. Like if you want to get in housing, There's a lot of great housing advocates like Empower DC, One DC, DC Grassroots Planning Coalition. The DC Grassroots Planning Coalition is amazing. They meet once a month. They do teach-ins. They educate you about what's happening, and then they do all these great, advocacy campaigns, around different, gentrification projects and things like that. Fair Budget Coalition is working on, making a, fair budget, for every community. Anti-racism organizations like a Black Lives Matter, Black Youth Project, Stop Police Terror Project. There's a lot of great organizations. Surge, which is like a white anti-racism organization, which seems weird, but it's actually really fantastic if you're like white and you're new to a lot of this anti-racism work. They really help you kind of understand what's going on, understand, work with your own biases and your internalizations, and then kind of help you like find places to fit in the anti-racism movement. So it's a really amazing organization. Food sovereignty, if you want to work on building food sovereignty, like Dreaming Out Loud, DC Urban Greens, ROC, which is the Restaurant Opportunity Center, the ARC, really great organization, especially like what ROC's working on right now is a lot of our undocumented workers or so essential workers, but they've been, there's not a whole lot of funding and support from them right now during COVID. So they've been doing a lot of massive campaigns around that, bringing, help towards these essential workers. If you want to learn more, check out People School. There's tons of organizations like you want to get involved in immigration, homelessness, different things like that. There's big lists of different organizations. But a big one I recommend is before you start showing up these meetings and start telling everybody what you think they should do, learn how to be a good ally. There's a really great 5-minute clip on Shante the Artist on YouTube. That it's nothing hard. It's not complicated. It's just like the idea of like how to amplify and listen and amplify instead of like co-op and dominate. A lot of it's just about just listening. We just need to listen more. A lot of this is about doing our own anti-racism work as well, understanding that, all of us were born into this white supremacy society. So taking like classes, like Surge does classes, Sandra Kim has a lot of online classes around our internalized white supremacy and about understanding what we've internalized. And by understanding that you're going to be such a much more powerful advocate, to actually dismantling these systems. And then a lot of it's about learning our local history. We have amazing organizations, and museums like Anacostia Smithsonian has this awesome exhibit called Right to the City, where they, so it's just a history of housing advocacy. Prologue DC is this nonprofit, a bunch of historians that map out racial covenants and racial segregation in DC. We have amazing, African American History Museum, the Reginald Lewis Museum in Baltimore, the Building Museum had like an amazing exhibit. I don't know if it's still there, but it's evicted. It's all about our housing crisis. We have, DC area educators for social justice, that do all different kinds of awesome local, education classes. And like in their books, Capital City and Capital Dilemma. I also read like Black Food Geographies. Go Go Live is a really great book, kind of talking about gentrification and like how go-go music has been this like big, focal point of tension between gentrification and Black history and local history. And then just organizing like local advocacy. So one of the most powerful things that you could do, because whenever I'm in these, like, if you go to these meetings like Empower DC and they talk about these like giant developments that are basically dominating, and a lot of times they happen because there's no organized resistance. There's no, and one of the most powerful organized forms of resistance is tenant associations. If you can actually create tenant associations, you're going to have an organized resistance to any kind of like change or developments or any kind of policies coming down the line. Understanding like local budgets and understanding, when to like public hearings and especially zoning appeals. A lot of these huge developments, they have to go, across lots of different zones. So they have to get appeals, and that's, and it goes across this commission that basically they're supposed to make sure that these developments are good for the community and they're not going to displace people. But most of the times they just get, unless no one shows up, they just kind of get rubber stamped. So a lot of these things like comment periods and, it could be a lot to kind of handle and kind of figure it all out. So that's why the easiest way is just kind of pick like a housing advocacy organization and just like, get on their newsletter, show up through their monthly meetings and their teach-ins, and they're gonna, kind of show you where you can plug in and what advocacy you can do. So this is a great list of great organizations that are all working on, fighting gentrification in DC. Like I said, DC Grassroots Planning Coalition is a great one to start with their monthly meetings, but I think One DC also does monthly meetings, and Empower DC is like, they're like at the front lines of like almost most of our gentrification battles, which is like, so these are a couple, this is a list of different things. I'm not going to dive too deeply into all of them, but just kind of understanding, like, here's kind of the major battles right now with gentrification. There's a lot of developments right now, public housing developments that are, again, because we defunded these public housing since the 50s. They need to be repaired, and they're going to, no, the budget, the city claims it doesn't have the budget, so so they look towards, private developers, and they're happy they'll pay for everything as long as we give up a lot of our public housing, and then they make it all market rate. Like, for example, Berry Farms, has 440 public housing, units, and they're going to rebuild it, but with 100 fewer, public housing units, affordable housing units. And at the same time, they kick everybody off, and then it'll be years before they can come back, and most people will never be able to come back, or if they do, they can't afford the rates, or they can't, or everything, because they redeveloped the whole thing as market rate, it just ends up gentrifying the whole neighborhood, and they can't afford to live there anymore. So the same thing's happened with Brooklyn Manor, over in like Ward 5. They had 535 affordable units. The new one's going to have 373. Kenilworth, it's just going to be completely redeveloped, and it's going to be bad for the people that live there and won't be able to afford the new Kenilworth. So there's a lot of, public housing issues. There's a big one, like there's a citywide tenant union that's forming right now. So if you're looking for help with tenants, stuff. So definitely, like I said, I'll share these slides with you all. So if you want to, find, learn a little bit more about gentrification in DC. And the last thing I want to talk about is, we put this together because a lot of times if you're new to like anti-racism work, it could be kind of overwhelming, where you tap into and stuff. So we actually created this hierarchy where you can kind of see, like, on the bottom, you tap in where you're at. If you're new to this, maybe you just need to take some classes, learn some more, to show up to some meetings. Believe people of color's experiences. Don't argue with people about their experiences. And then as you start moving up, you want to push yourself to kind of becoming more involved with organizations and rallies, donating more time and money to like personally confronting different racist policies and people, to actually working on dismantling systems and creating like alternatives to policing and things like that to the top. So the idea is to kind of fit in where you want and you kind of work your way up. All right, so that's about it. So this is the last slide. Just kind of gives maps out a lot of different resources that I talked about, readings and local resources and stuff like that. And yeah, thank you all so much for. I'm happy to kind of stick around. If you want, you can feel free if you want to unmute yourself, and if you want to ask some questions or talk about some things. Hopefully, like I said, hopefully my goal wasn't to depress everybody, but just kind of make them motivated, and hopefully with some ideas of how to tap into it. But yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you all so much. Thanks, Megan. Like I said, I'll share the slides. I'll upload the slides into the link, the Google Doc with all the other slides. But yeah, if you can't, if you don't see it, definitely send me an email in the next day or two, and I'll share the slides with you.